Hello, everyone. Welcome to MACSMIN 2024. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Cristian Micheletti from Italy. So it's a Institute of Advanced Studies, but the Italian acronym is a bit more complicated. And Cristian will talk about design self-assembly of molecular nodes. Over to you, Cristian, please.
Thank you, Vitaly. It's really a pleasure for me to take part virtually to the MACSMIN meeting. I thank Vitaly for the kind invitation, and I had hoped to be there in person with all of you. In the end, I couldn't due to duties and constraints. So I understand that this hybrid format sometimes does not work well because the online speaker can be out of tune with the audience. I hope this will not happen in this case. In any case, thank you for your patience in advance. So what I will present to you today is work that has been going on in our group for the past few years. So I'm a theoretical and computational physicist, and we work at the interface, let's say, of mathematics, topology, physics, biology, and chemistry to some extent. Of course, we are physicists, so we are not experts in all these topics. And a few years ago, we were intrigued by the efforts, many of which have been spearheaded by Professor Lee, that we heard his beautiful talk yesterday, about the design, the synthesis of molecular nodes. And that presents a number of challenges from the chemical point of view, but also challenges also from the physics point of view, trying to understand what are the physical underpinnings that lead to the assembly of these complex and challenging molecules. This is why they are so attractive to tackle from the chemical point of view. And if you wanted to make progress in designing ever more complex molecules with in topologies of increasing complexity, you need to have an understanding about what are the physical underpinnings that make them designable and addressable. So I will try to show to what extent you can harness coarse-grained models to advance the capability to design the molecules. I will first consider molecular nodes. So these are so-called self-limited molecular assemblies because they are somehow closed over themselves. They are limited from the spatial point of view. And then I will try to broaden the perspectives to, let's say, a class of materials that is attracting increasing attention nowadays that are extended topological assemblies. So these are, let's say, supramolecular constructs that instead of being closed on themselves, they can in principle extend indefinitely in space. So they're really the prototype for new types of materials that are held together not by covalent bonds, but so-called topological or mechanical bonding. So an example of that I will discuss are molecular chainmails. So okay, so probably a good way to start and introduce the problem is by showing this slide that I think probably it was very similar to one of the slides that Professor Lee showed yesterday, that is summarizes somehow what has been the first successful effort of synthetic chemists in designing a complex molecular knot. So the first type of non-trivial molecular knot. Actually, it was a molecular link, what mathematicians would call a Hopf link. That is the link between topological link between two rings. So the idea, so this has been on the dream list of synthetic chemists for 50 years before it was actually realized. And it's interesting to go a little bit just into the concepts that were harnessed to produce these molecules. So the idea was the following. You start with a closed molecule already, so a macrocycle. And this macrocycle, this closed molecule, has a binding site that has an affinity for binding a metal ion, in this case, a copper ion, as you see here. Then you put in solution a set of ligands that are not closed, open ligands, C-shaped, as you can see here, that also have a binding site with an affinity to bind copper. And therefore, these C-shaped ligands will actually thread the already formed closed circle, be hooked there, and then by introducing another set of suitable ligands, so the complementary part to the C-shaped ligand that you put in the first place, you can close the loop and essentially you end up with two interlocked molecules. At that point, by chemical means, you can get rid of the metal ion. So you can we say that they demetallate the resulting molecule that they obtain, and therefore you end up with two interlocked molecules. So this is probably, or almost certainly, the simplest type of topological constraint that you can have at the supramolecular level. So a standard measure of topological complexity is given by the number of crossings that you have in the simplest possible two-dimensional projection that you can make of the molecule. So now here we are looking at a two-dimensional projection because this is like a 2D representation of the molecules. And you can see that the number of crossing is 2. One crossing here, another crossing there, if you project it. Smaller than that, fewer than that, you cannot have for non-trivial molecules. So this was naturally the simplest type of molecular knot. It's a molecular link, but mathematically it's a knot. And instead, if you turn your attention to what each of us would call a knot, the simplest knot that you can see represented here is more complex, because to form the simplest knot, you actually need to have 3 crossings. So naturally, it is more complex than the molecule that you just saw. So a few years passed after the first attempt that I showed in the previous slide. And in 1989, the same group, Sauvage and co-workers, actually were able to design this trefoil knot, the simplest proper intramolecular knot, by using the same concepts as before. Instead of using C-shaped ligands, they used the S-shaped building blocks with a binding affinity for metal ions. Each of them binds 2 metal ions, and you have 2 interlocked S shapes. If you close them by putting other ligands in reaction and doing a closure reaction, you end up with a molecule that has 3 crossings, 1, 2, and 3. And although the geometry appears to be different from the one of the knot that you see here, the topology is exactly the same. So meaning that if you tie this knot in a rope, you can arrange, by pulling the rope, you can arrange it so that the geometry is the same as that. So topologically, they are equivalent. So here we were, 1989. These were the only 2 types of non-trivial molecular knots that have been designed at a time. So a link and the simplest knot type. So this is an excerpt from a mathematical table of knots. The knots are listed for increasing complexity. As I mentioned before, the complexity is measured as the number of crossings that you have. So you have 1, 2, 3. This is the 3 crossing knot. There is only one. The next knot, higher up in complexity, is the figure of 8 knot for obvious reasons. As you see here, it has 4 crossings, 1, 2, 3, 4. There is only one. If you go to 5 crossings, there are 2 inequivalent knot types that cannot be interconverted one into the other. So they're not different geometrical representations. They are in different classes, topological classes. This is the 5-1 knot. It's a torus knot. Torus knot because you can see that there is a systematicity in the way that you can form it by going over and under the chain in a systematic way. And then there is this other knot type. Same complexity, but very different topology. Many years had to pass before David Lee and co-workers managed to actually synthesize the 5-crossing knot, the one that I just showed on the table. And here is the chemical representation of the knot. We saw it yesterday in one of the slides of Professor Lee. And so here we were in 2012. So the idea is the same that was pioneered by Sauvage. You exploit metal ions to coordinate the essential crossings that you want to pin, and then you have to be clever to identify the right ligands to put there with the right curvature and how to close them in order to get the molecular knot. So the design principle is simple, but of course the realization is very challenging. And here you have 1 central metal ions, and then these purple atoms here are metal ions too. So it becomes increasingly more complex, but you can coordinate with these metal ions the essential crossings, you bridge your building blocks, and you end up with the knots. So this provides a very powerful strategy to design molecular knots. And a couple of years later, also the figure of 8 knot, which has 4 crossings, was realized by different strategies. So here we were in 2012, a dozen years ago. The simplest knot types in the table of mathematical knots have been realized. So at that point, there was a question that somehow was out on the table that was the following. What would be the next ideal target for molecular synthesis? Should one go for this knot type, the so-called 5-2 knot, this one here? It has the same nominal complexity of a knot that have been realized. So you might say that is an obvious target. Or should one go for other type of knots? Here, the pattern seems to be that you just go systematically high up in complexity in a systematic way. However, there are considerations that go against this naive expectation that you should just go up the ladder of complexity in a steady way. And the considerations are the following. If you consider any type of model that people have studied, or polymer model that people have studied, and that used to measure the type of knots that you form in equilibrium, you see that the abundance of knots that you form in equilibrium, just for entropic reason, does not go in a monotonic way with knot complexity. Let me say it in a different way that is presumably familiar with our almost everyday experience. So we are all familiar that when you store away your cables, your Christmas lights, or the earphones, when they had a cord, you put them in the pocket, or somehow you package them. When you retrieve them, you're bound to have knots there if they are sufficiently long. Well, if you look at the knot types that you have in these, let's say, type of stochastic knot formation, which you might say is like having a polymer in equilibrium that can knot itself with no particular design, just because it's flexible and sufficiently long, you see that the knot types that you have are not random. You don't have their abundance does not follow in a simple way the ladder of complexity. You tend to have certain knots that are much more represented than others. For example, just taking these 2 knots with the same nominal complexity, 5 crossing knots, we see that the twist knot here, the 5-2, this knot here, is more probable, almost twice as probable as this knot there, the 5-1 knot, the torus knots. So in this case, the model was very simple. It was a freely jointed chain, a freely jointed ring. There was no self-avoidance. You just, the chain was 100 segments long. You explore all possible configurations because there is no self-avoidance. Some of them will be knotted. You measure what type of knots that you have. There is no bias whatsoever. There is no energy, only entropy. And it turns out that certain knots are more probable than others, even for the same complexity, nominal complexity. This is very general. It has nothing to do with the fact that the chain is only 100 segments long. In fact, here I'm just pulling data from a paper of colleagues where they looked at the equilibrium probability of knots in these freely jointed rings that can self-intersect themselves. If you look at the abundance of the same knots that I mentioned before, so 5-1 and 5-2, you see that the 5-2 knot is the black triangle curve here. I hope it's visible on the screen, so I'm tracing with my mouse. And the 5-1 knot is this yellow. I know that the color is unfortunate. That's the figure from the paper. You see that is systematically below the other at all lengths. So it means there is something fundamental, let's say, of entropic accessibility. So these are Monte Carlo simulations. So it's not kinetic accessibility. There is a freely jointed ring, no bending rigidity, no excluded volume interactions. So there is no energy term, just entropy. There is just a larger conformational space that favors this knot type compared to the other. So to us, that was an indication, just a suggestion. So Vitaly, you had a question?
Yeah. Cristian, could I ask about the previous graph? Yes. Could I check if at every fixed length the sum of probabilities is indeed 100%?
It's if you you can if you include also the probability to be unknotted, which is this black curve up here. No? So indeed, these should sum to 100%.
So even the probability of the unknot goes down.
Yes. Yes, because the longer is the chain, the more unlikely it is that it's free of knots.
I see.
And it actually decays asymptotically. It decays exponentially. The probability of being unknotted decays exponentially fast with the length of the rings.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So these considerations were a hint that the naive expectation that this is the ideal next target maybe is not granted, given the rules that you have to follow from the chemical point of view, that you need to use metal ions, that you need to have ligands that are bent in order to bind to the metal ions and to close off themselves. It's not obvious what is the most designable one. So given the rules that chemists use to synthesize molecular knots, which of these knot types has the highest, let's say, configurational phase space associated to it? Because that is what predisposes the knot to be designable. And you would like to identify these privileged topologies that are easier to make just from the entropic point of view, so that you go along with what physics predisposes to be knotted. So we wanted to, we had no obvious a priori principle, physical principle to guide us in the search of knots. So what we did is we resorted to simulation. So let's say, why don't we let, let's say, physics point out to us what are the designable topologies. So we used a very basic model, We built on the idea, we wanted to mimic what chemists did because we wanted to give a verifiable prediction to them, some empirical guidelines to search for designable molecular knots. And so we followed the assembly principle. We wanted to have the equivalent of molecular knots that in the simulations would assemble into closed structures. We have seen in the example before that if you want to obtain a knotted molecule, which is a closed circular molecule, you need to have some intrinsic curvature in order to close on yourself. And therefore, it was natural for us to use as building blocks for assembly curved elements. And based on the very basic notion that if you just live in flatland, so if you live in 2D, you cannot have knots. You need to have three-dimensionality in order to have knots, because you need to do over and under passes in your center line of your knotted molecules. Not only we needed to have curved building blocks, but they also needed to have some intrinsic three-dimensionality to it. So the obvious choice for us, starting point at least, was to consider building blocks that were pieces of helices, which is what we used. So we used segments of helices. We used a chain of beads, just to have a coarse-grained representation of that. So here you see the representation of one of our building blocks. They are chains of beads, but they are rigid. So each of these building block is geometrically locked. So it does not have an internal flexibility. And in order to have these curved helical fragments bind to themselves, we decorated the two end beads with a patch, interactive patch. So the first and last bead are patchy particles, which is this white dot here. And if these patches of two molecules or two building blocks come sufficiently close, they bind with a binding energy that is a few kBT, a few thermal energy units. So we do an assembly, fixed temperature, the binding energy is a few kBT. It's not tens of kBT, because we wanted to have a reversible binding. It's a few kBt. We don't want it to be labile. We want to stick, but not be reversible. Otherwise, it would be out of equilibrium. We put hundreds of these building blocks in the simulation box, let the system evolve, establish equilibrium, then we open the box and we see what products, if we got any knotted molecules. We have two control parameters. One control parameter is the pitch, is the out of plane, how much out of plane is our template. This is the H parameter, so it's related to the pitch of the helix. And the other is what is the angular span projected by the template. And we explore both of these combinations. So we have two parameters, alpha and H. The radius of the helix, we keep it fixed. So we just have two parameters, and one we set it as the unit length. So we can summarize what happens in our model system for molecular assembly with a two-dimensional diagram. So one axis is the pitch, or the, let's say, the out of plane projection, H, height, H, and the other is the angular span, okay? So when H is small, you have flat building blocks. When alpha is small, you have a small fragment where that covers a small angle. As it increases, you can cover up to 2 pi, and we don't go to things longer than 2 pi. So it would be too involved. What you see in this state diagram is, as a function of these two parameters, what is the most likely type of constructs that you establish in equilibrium. So if you are in this region here, that is to say, mostly nearly flat building blocks, what you tend to assemble are linear structures. So these are snake-like structures that are very unlikely to close on themselves. Instead, when you have building blocks that are quite three-dimensional, that have a substantial height compared to the radius, what you see is that you tend to form structures that are closed on themselves. This is already promising, because if you have closed structures, there is a chance that a certain fraction of them are knotted.
Christian, sorry.
Yes.
Christian, sorry, can I ask a question?
Please.
Sticky ends, what's the angular, how much angle you allow between those two sticky ends to bind?
Okay, there is a tolerance. It's not a huge tolerance, but let's say that it's, I don't remember the angle, but it's almost collinear. So it's not the full angle when the two templates bind.
Because that would change a lot, right? That would change your landscape a lot. If you put, like, you know, hemisphere around it, it then can form all kinds of structures, even when they are flat.
I think so. I think so. Also, the probability to close on themselves would go down. So it's nearly collinear with some tolerance. Let's say I'm making it up. The tolerance could be of the order of 20 degrees, but it's finite, it's small. Yes. There is an angular selectivity.
So this is the potential parameter number 3 here in the model.
That's right. We don't vary that. Right. So let's say that there is, if you wish, one parameter. We didn't play with this parameter. One parameter is certainly the depth of the well, so how many kBT, so that we fixed a few kBT. And the other is the angular tolerance. And we didn't at all tune that. So I expect results to be robust. But in a way, so I think a good approximation is to think of our templates as being predisposed to bind in a collinear fashion, okay? So if you do molecular, if I were to do Monte Carlo, maybe I would strictly enforce collinearity. In molecular dynamics, you need to have continuous potential. So wiggle room around the collinearity.
Okay. Thank you, Christian.
Okay. Yeah, but definitely, if you make it fully flexible, I would expect the closure probability, ring-like structures, to be much suppressed, for instance. Yeah. Okay, so this is the phase diagram. Having closed structure is essential to have knots because proper knots, because if you have a knot in an open chain, that is not a proper non-trivial topological state for mathematicians. And so we looked for knots and we did find them. The knots are most abundant at the crossover between the most probable ring structures and the most probable linear structures. So at the boundary regions where you have both types with equal probability, you tend to have knots. So this is just a result, it's not a prediction. This is the outcome of our simulations. When you see probability of 30% and higher, it means that 30% or more of the building blocks are involved in constructs that are knotted. Now, the question is, what type of knots do we get? What knots do we observe? Now, this is just, there are knots, what are they? So you can take your guess about which knots we found. I can anticipate that we found only 3 types of knots forming recurrently. We found many knot types, but some of them were very rare. 3 of them were systematic. So there are regions in the state diagram where you see them over and over again with a sizable probability. So you can take your guess what they could be. Maybe you will not be surprised to see that the simplest type of knot, the trefoil knot that we saw before, is indeed the most likely knot to form with our building blocks, as long as you have the right curvature and right out of plane. There is a tolerance. So throughout this region of the state diagram, the most abundant non-trivial topology is the trefoil knot. NT equals 3 means that you form it with 3 building blocks, 3 template blocks, which tells you that it's not too complex to form. So you just need a limited number of building blocks to form. How many you need is a measure of difficulty of the design. So 3 is a small number. This is the other knot type that we have. Well, really, I shouldn't say the other knot type because it's the same knot type, but it's a different geometry. Is again the trefoil knot, although you may not recognize it, but it's the same trefoil knot in topology, except that it has a different geometry. And this time you form it with 4 building blocks. Small number, not as small as 3, but again, a recurrent geometry, a recurrent geometrical knot type, different from the previous one. And then there was only another one that we had not anticipated at all, which is a very complex knot, as you can see here. It is an 8 crossing knot. So this is how it presents itself. NT equals 4 means that it's as difficult to form in terms of number of building blocks that you need as the trefoil knot. So trefoil knot is much simpler in topology along the table. Here you have 8 crossings. So you skip all the 5, 6, 7 crossing knots, which are dozens, and you land on this topology that is much more complex than the trefoil knot, and that somehow was screaming at us that I'm designable. I'm a privileged topology. It has a broad entropic conformational space with which it can be formed. One of the reasons why this is a designable topology, I think, is obvious to all of us that are looking at it. It's a very symmetric topology. Clearly, that is a strong design principle, not that is harnessed by nature, biology, and so on. If you can use the same building blocks with the same type of patterns of interactions, then clearly you have something that is designable. Now, the question is, if you look at the table of knots, do I understand what is designable? Because that's not only a matter of topology, it's also a matter of how do I arrange the geometry of my construct so that it is symmetric. The results are very robust, meaning that you can change the density that you use in your assembly process. The abundance of the knots do depend on the density. That is correct. Statistical mechanics will tell you that. But apart from tuning the overall abundance, you can see that the dominant topologies and geometries are the ones that I've shown before. So essentially, here are the recurrent privileged topologies. And just to give you a flavor that these are not the only types, here is a gallery of a few of the other nodes that we got. But they are not as recurrent. They are almost like accidents. So this tells you that it's not the only thing that you can do, but these are really inherently much more designable. You can do even more complex topologies if you mix different type of templates of building blocks. So these we have played very little with. So these node types that you see here, they come out of assemblies that use monodispersed building blocks or building blocks of the same type. But like in metallurgy, when you can have alloys, by putting together different type of atoms, you can have a sort of topological alloys by putting in your simulation box templates with different geometries. And if you start with building blocks of one type, 100%, or of another type, 100%, or if you mix the two with some proportions, you can get knots that are not present with either of the pure monodispersed phases. For example, the phi crossing knots comes out as being designable if you use a mixture of different knot types with our rules. That is to say, there is a whole space of complexity that we have not explored, but it is there in case you wanted to put effort. I don't think we are going in that direction, but this additional complexity, it is there. So what I wanted to, the point that I wanted to drive home is the following. These were the topologies that have been realized up to that point by synthetic chemists. Our simulations indicated that this knot, which is highly symmetric in our assemblies, is highly designable. It's all the way down here in the table of knots of mathematicians. And if you look at how it is represented in the table of mathematicians, how its geometry is represented, you would never guess that these could actually be put in the symmetric form that comes out in our simulation. So if you take these tables too literally, you may not even be inspired in picking your target. So somehow our simulations was essential to tell us as a result, so not as a our prediction, but as a result of the simulation, that this is a designable topology, it's highly symmetric, probably a worthy target. And so here we were almost a decade ago, and 2 years after we identified this privileged topology, we got an email from Professor Lee saying, I actually have a realization of the molecular knot that you identified, and you can see it here. It's exactly the same geometry. Of course, doing it from the synthetic chemist point of view must have been very challenging. Several metal ions to coordinate, different ligand types. So obviously, the must have been very complicated to make. And these knot, if I remember well, I'm pretty sure, made it in the Guinness Book of World Records as the most complex molecular knot being synthesized. So just to make the point of how difficult it was. But the point is that even from the chemical point of view, after these targets, the next structure that was actually synthesized is the one that we have identified from the simulations. So all these other structures, also from the practical point of view, were not as designable as the one that was picked from the simulation. So I think this is very inspiring from the point of view of physicists. We don't have, it would be nice for us to have another parameter, something constructive that would allow us to be predictive without the simulations to point out the designable molecular knots. We don't have that, so we can be content with having the simulations. But what is inspiring is the fact that if you compare the synthetic molecular knot and the one that we simulated, okay, you can see that the contour, the backbone is the same, but actually this is a very crude caricature of the synthetic molecular knots. We don't have any metal ions here. We have not modeled the chemical interactions of these groups. Our rules for assembly are certainly different from those followed by chemists. And this is certainly a defect of the model. But at the same time, I would say it's what makes the model interesting. It's like a caricature. A caricature is not a faithful representation like a photograph of a person, but if the caricature, if it is done well with a few traits, allows you to single out the most important points to identify that particular person. So essentially, it means that the model is sufficient to identify the entropic, the high entropic accessibilities of topologies. And then you can harness it in specific ways with chemical details. But somehow you go along the highway, the entropic highway that physics has predisposed, no? And you shouldn't go against it if you want to limit your efforts. So let's see if these plays. No, it doesn't. So the video does not work.
Christian,
Yes.
what if you open your video in different window and try sharing another window?
Let me see if I can do that. So is yeah, yes. Are you still seeing my presentation?
Yes, we can still see here in a bit smaller scale, but no problem.
Yeah, okay. So it seems that in full presentation mode it doesn't work, but anyway, it should be good enough. So here you see 3D printed building blocks, which I actually have here in my office too. So it's exactly what I have here. So these are 3D printed. The interactions are provided by magnets. So they are polar interactions, unlike the patchy particles. The thermal fluctuations I was providing by hand, as you saw. And these structures, they actually repeatedly form. So these are macroscopic, obviously. They repeatedly form in a reliable and robust way. They assemble into the trefoil knot that you see, okay? So interestingly, if you give it to people, and if you give the building blocks and you ask them to arrange them into the trefoil knot, they find it very difficult. So this is not staged. People are not able to do it very quickly. And I think there is a lesson there. Somehow really to do it in an unbiased way allows you to explore the right curvature for binding these objects together that stochastically lead to the stable state. While if you try to follow not curvature that look more natural from the human point of view, you had a hard time. Okay, so this was somehow entertainment, but that is to say, so this design principle is something that it's really robust. Okay, and for more complex ones, you should see the video. Actually, so you should see the paper to see what what happens. Okay. Now I see that I'm running a little bit slower than expected. So
10 more minutes easily, no problem.
10 more minutes. Okay. So we wanted to model a little bit more closely what experimentalists were able to do. And therefore, we took as a rule, we incorporated in our assembly rules with Monte Carlo molecular dynamics, some of the phenomenological constraints that chemists were using in synthesizing molecular knots. In particular, because molecular knots that have been designed were cyclic symmetric, so having cyclic symmetry as the knot here, the pentafoil knot, the trefoil knot, you see that if you turn by a suitable angle, you form the molecular knots. A natural question was, what if we restrict the considerations just to structures that have cyclic symmetry? What are the designable structures that you can have, and can we rank them for complexity? So these we explored with Monte Carlo simulations. Not the details are not important. So we just explored the configurational space of closed structure, different curvature of the building blocks, different heights as before, And at the end of our exploration, we filtered and we sieved the structure that we got and selected them for symmetry, essentially, for cyclic symmetry, a posteriori. What were they? And we identified, again, a limited number of privileged topologies that included those that we found before, plus many more. But we also learned somehow the grammar that we should follow in order to produce ever more complex structures. And essentially, we identified the two measures of complexity. So let me give this notion. Maybe it's a little bit too advanced now for people that are not too interested in the topic, but let me try to give it anyway. So knots you can represent, of course, as a closed curve, but mathematically, a very natural representation of knots is the so-called braid representation, which you see here. You have certain strands, a number of strands that are intertwined, and then you apply periodic boundary conditions to your braid. So it's like closing it on themselves. If you do that, you obtain your closed structure that is knotted as a single chain. Well, it turns out that this braid representation, which is very naturally suited to for knots that have cyclic symmetry, because cyclic symmetry means periodicity in your braid once that it is linearized. So you have two natural measures of complexity. One is what is the periodicity? That is the degree of cyclic symmetry. How many boxes that repeat do I have? And how many strands are intertwined? Here you have a periodicity of 3, cyclic symmetry 3, 2 strands. Here you have periodicity 4, repeats 4 times, cyclic symmetry 4, and the 3 strands. So obviously, both numbers are a measure of complexity. And once that you understand these rules, you can actually construct a table that can go on indefinitely, and where you rank the possible molecular knots that you can obtain according to the degree of symmetry, how many strands you need to braid, and also the periodicity. So these are the two measures. If you go along the two axes, so when we published this table, this was popularized as the periodic table of knots. Of course, it's not, but okay, you understand the idea is something systematic, not that you can use to classify. And it turns out that if you apply these rules, not only you end up with proper knots, but you also end up with links. So the structures that you get involve more than one molecules that are topologically intertwined and interlocked. And by the time that we published this work, synthetic chemists had actually synthesized many more knots and link types, which are all the circle ones that you see here. So you can see that somehow the simplest ones, those that live in the upper left corner of this table, have been synthesized. And as in the example before, this knot here, an 8 crossing knot, but different from the one before, this crossing knot has been published after our study had been conducted and submitted. So again, there is a predictive capability of these simple models that one can harness to inspire and guide, hopefully, simplify the design of for the knots. Now, I would like to conclude in the last 5 minutes by just giving you a flavor. I understand that I'm running out of time, but I just want to give you a flavor. I think I have 3 slides on, let's say, a more modern, more up-to-date direction that the field is taking at the moment after being after having learned the ropes on molecular knots that are also called that are part of the so-called self-limited assemblies, meaning that what self-assembles has a finite size because it closes on itself. It cannot grow indefinitely. People are increasingly interested into structures, I would say materials, people call it metamaterials, that can grow indefinitely in space and that are kept together not by covalent bonds, but by topological bonds. So very often in the literature, you might find the notion of mechanical bond, which is exactly the same. So these are topological bonds. One notable example of an extended structure that is held together by mechanical bonds is actually found in biology. It has been known by biologists since, documented since the 60s and 70s, is in the arrangement of mitochondrial DNA of some parasites. The DNA, instead of being organized as a filament, like in eukaryotic chromosomes, it is actually organized as a chain mail. So this is actually this is a micrograph of how these the DNA of these organisms is found. So the DNA is made by circular DNAs, all interlocked with one another. So here the structure in this. So am I okay? Here the structure is not very visible at all. But biologists that have spent time looking at it, they represent it schematically in the following way. This is an idealization because it's a regular honeycomb lattice. It's not a regular honeycomb lattice, underlying it, but it is true that it is made of interlocked DNA rings. So this is already existing in biology, raising all sorts of questions. How does it replicate itself? How does it self-assemble? So these are aspects that I'm not able to comment on because biologists are still addressing these questions and certainly have no answer for them. I just give you just give you the fact that I take from biology. But this type of existing structures have inspired physicists and biophysicists, and surely also chemists, in trying to think how you can design such extended materials. So we have ongoing work on that, but let me give you, I've not talked about the self-assembly of these, they are so-called Olympic gels, also rings that are all interlocked and form an extended structures like the Olympic logo. Instead, I will tell you about a recent work where we asked the following question. Suppose that I take a chainmail, an idealized chainmail like this one with honeycomb structure, just inspired by these biological ones. But if I look at the chainmail, each ring I can interlock with the neighbors in many different ways because I got many choices of over and under crossings that I can make in order to interlock the ring. What is the effect on the final structure, if any, of the local choices that I make? So to address this problem, and then I've got only one slide left, so I hope I'm in time, we consider just two possible alternative pattern of linking rings. As you can see, our chainmail has the architecture, so the blueprint is a honeycomb lattice. So each ring is connected to other three, and you form these hexagonal patterns. But then the ring, the purple ring, are linked to their neighbors with this pattern. So under, under, over, over, under. And the green ring are instead over, over, under, under, over, under. Okay, so different patterns. They are inequivalent. In an extended chainmail, you cannot flip from one to the other because there are constraints, topological constraints. You cannot flip. They are topologically inequivalent. Are there any differences? Or does it just matter the fact that you have a honeycomb architecture or the linking affects the result? Well, it turns out that there is a huge difference between the two. One of the patterns that I showed you, so this one here, where let's say the more uniform one, with the everything is interlocked with the purple ring, actually spontaneously acquires a negative Gaussian curvature in the structures in the membranes, linked membranes that we obtained. The natural shape that it acquires is a Pringle, so it's a negative Gaussian curvature. Instead, if your architecture is superimposed with this alternating linking pattern, you see no appreciable intrinsic curvature whatsoever. So we found that particularly interesting. First of all, nobody had reported before the emergence of spontaneous negative Gaussian curvature in the chains. And I'm pleased to say that a partner group in California by Alex Klotz and so on has also recently found results that support this picture here. This is something that in covalently bonded sheets you can obtain only if you introduce defects. You have an excess point or you remove one, you can introduce these features, but otherwise they don't come up. So that tells you that by going to these metamaterials of interlocked rings, you really have a big latitude in harnessing the local topological constraints to produce global emergent features that modulate the structures. And we have not looked yet at the dynamics, but presumably also the dynamics is something that can be affected. So this is my summary slides. You can read it faster than me, so I will not bother you with that. I will just highlight the key persons that have been involved in the study, including Salvatore Assenza, Matteo Becchi, Juan Luengo, Enzo Landini, and Guido Polles, and Antonio Sumatu. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Cristian. Okay, I'll stop recording and